The 1993 superstorm was no ordinary tempest. It was a monstrous force of nature that tore through the East Coast like a vengeful deity, leaving devastation in its wake. For 3 days, the skies howled with rage, the winds screamed like banshees, and the earth seemed to tremble under its fury. But for Claire Hewitt, a meteorology intern, it wasn't just the storm that terrified her. It was what the storm seemed to bring with it. Claire had been stationed at a remote weather observation outpost in Appalachia, tasked with monitoring the storm's progress. On the first night, as the storm began to rage, she stared at the radar screen. It pulsated with unnatural patterns, a swirling black void at the center of the storm, darker than anything she'd ever seen. "That's impossible," she whispered to herself. Storm systems had eyes, yes, but not like this. This felt alive. Her radio crackled to life. Claire. It was her supervisor, Dr. Morley, speaking from the main station several miles away. "Yes, Dr. Morley, I'm here. Have you seen this anomaly?" There was a pause, a hesitation that made her stomach knot. "We see it. And Claire, don't go outside, no matter what you hear." Thud. She jumped as a deafening noise reverberated through the building. It sounded like something large had struck the roof. Her heart pounded. "What was that?" she whispered, clutching the radio. "Stay inside," Dr. Morley repeated, his voice strained. "We're tracking movement, unnatural movement, within the storm. Just lock the doors and wait for morning." The radio went silent, leaving her alone with the howl of the wind and the ominous creaks of the building. Hours passed, each second dragging on like an eternity. The power flickered, the lights dimming and then surging back to life, casting strange shadows on the walls. Jump scare. Bang, bang, bang. A frantic pounding at the door made her scream. "Help me, please!" A man's voice cried from the other side. She froze. Dr. Morley's warning echoed in her mind. "Don't go outside." But the man's cries were desperate, filled with terror. "They're coming. Let me in." Before she could decide, the pounding stopped abruptly. Silence fell, heavy and unnatural. Claire hesitated, then peeked through the window. The storm's winds whipped violently, but there was no sign of the man. Only footprints leading away from the door, barefoot and erratic like someone had been running. She backed away, her breathing shallow. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. As the storm worsened, strange noises began emanating from the walls. Faint whispers at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. "Claire." She spun around, her blood running cold. Someone had whispered her name. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No reply, just the wind and the whispers. Desperate for answers, she turned to the radar screen. The black void at the storm center had grown larger, darker, and then, to her horror, it began to shift. It wasn't a void. It was a shape, a figure, a face. Thud. The roof groaned as something heavy landed on it again. Claire's stomach churned as she realized whatever it was. It hadn't left. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. Her flashlight beam darted around the room, illuminating nothing but the emptiness. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a deafening roar, and the windows shattered inward, spraying her with glass. She screamed, collapsing to the floor. When she opened her eyes, she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated like branches stripped bare. Its face was a void, featureless yet somehow staring directly at her. "Claire," it rasped, its voice like the grinding of stone. She scrambled backward, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. "What do you want?" she cried. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, as if pondering her question. And then it spoke again, its voice echoing inside her mind. "You called us." She didn't understand. She hadn't called anyone. But then she remembered the radar, the anomaly, the warnings ignored. The storm wasn't a storm. It was a door, and she had opened it. Final twist. The next morning, the storm had passed. leaving a wake of destruction across the region. Rescue teams found the weather outpost, but it was empty. No sign of Claire, no footprints leading away. The only thing they found was her radar screen, still active. The black void had disappeared, replaced by a single line of text. It wasn't the storm that took her, it was what came through. But as they packed up to leave, one of the rescuers noticed something etched into the frost-covered window. A handprint, pressed from the inside. And from the trees, in the stillness of the aftermath, came a faint whisper. "Claire." The wind howled like a mourning banshee over the desolate Sierra Nevada wilderness. Snow blanketed the landscape, smothering the faint traces of life beneath its icy grasp. It was the winter of 1846, and the Donner Party, a caravan of pioneers in search of the fabled riches of California, had been stranded for weeks, trapped by relentless storms. Food had long run out, and hunger had taken on a life of its own, gnawing at their sanity. Inside a hastily built cabin of sticks and mud, Elizabeth Foster sat by a dying fire. Her gaunt face was a shadow of its former self, her once bright eyes now hollow, reflecting the flickering light. She clutched her threadbare shawl tightly as whispers echoed from the darkness outside. "Did you hear that?" she asked her husband, Samuel, who sat sharpening a knife with deliberate, rhythmic strokes. "It's just the wind," he muttered, though his trembling hands betrayed him. But Elizabeth knew better. The whispers, they were real. Faint, disjointed words drifting from the trees like ghostly murmurs. And with each passing night, they grew louder, closer. Thud! The sound of something heavy crashing against the cabin door jolted her from her thoughts. She gasped, clutching Samuel's arm. He froze, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. No reply, only the wind, now eerily silent. Summoning his courage, Samuel opened the door a crack, revealing nothing but swirling snow. Yet, as the door creaked open further, Elizabeth saw them, footprints, human, barefoot, leading away into the woods. The next morning, a group of men from the camp visited their cabin. Faces pale with despair, they spoke in hushed tones of something unspeakable. They found Henry Reed. One of them whispered, his voice shaking, "Or what's left of him." Elizabeth recoiled. Henry had gone missing 2 days prior, last seen stumbling into the storm in search of food. "What do you mean, what's left?" Samuel pressed. "They found his body hanging from a tree. No tracks leading in, no tracks leading out. Just him. And his heart was missing." Days stretched into weeks. The whispers returned, now accompanied by scratches on the walls at night. Faint at first, then frantic. Elizabeth tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. Her faith, like her body, had withered. The cabin was a prison. The storm outside raged endlessly, and within its icy cocoon, desperation festered. The group dwindled, death claimed some, and others vanished into the night, leaving only their screams echoing through the trees. One night, Samuel returned with something wrapped in his coat. He placed it on the table without a word, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Elizabeth didn't ask. She didn't want to know. But as he carved the mysterious slab of flesh, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside her head. Jump scare. Slam. The door flew open, wind and snow spilling into the cabin. Elizabeth screamed as a figure loomed in the doorway, gaunt and pale, its eyes glowing like embers. "Who are you?" Samuel shouted, brandishing his knife. The figure stepped forward, its skeletal grin widening. "I am what you've called upon." What do you mean?" Elizabeth stammered. The figure's grin faltered, replaced by a sneer. "You've prayed for deliverance, and I have answered, but salvation has a price." Samuel lunged at the intruder, but the knife passed through it as though it were made of mist. The figure laughed, a guttural, inhuman sound. "Do you not see?" it hissed. "You are your own undoing. The whispers, they were never me. They were yours." The next morning, Elizabeth woke to silence. The storm had stopped. The cabin was empty, Samuel was gone. But as she stepped outside, she froze. Scattered in the snow were bones, gnawed clean. At the center of the clearing, her husband's severed head rested atop a pile of flesh and entrails. His eyes had been gouged out. Her scream echoed through the forest. But then she saw it, the footprints. They didn't lead away from the cabin. They led toward it. Elizabeth staggered back, realizing the horrifying truth. She had been the one carving the flesh. She had been the one feeding on the others. Her hands, trembling and bloodied, moved to her mouth as memories came rushing back. The figure in the doorway wasn't real. The whispers weren't the wind. And in the stillness of the forest, she heard a voice, her own whispering, "You called for me, and I came." As she turned to run, the snow beneath her feet crunched unnaturally loud. She looked down and froze. The footprints weren't hers. They were following her. Final twist. Days later, a search party stumbled upon the abandoned cabin. They found no survivors, but etched into the walls, scrawled in blood, were these words: "The Donner Party fed on flesh to survive." But it wasn't the hunger that killed them. It was the things they awakened in the woods. As the rescuers turned to leave, they noticed something strange. Footprints trailing them back to camp. Barefoot, human, fresh. It was late December, the kind of cold that bites deep into your bones. The Kim family, Tom, his wife Sarah, and their young daughter Emily, were driving through the snow-blanketed wilderness of Wyoming, hoping to make it to Yellowstone before nightfall. Their GPS suggested a scenic shortcut, a desolate backroad flanked by towering pines. Against Sarah's better judgment, Tom insisted. As the last rays of daylight faded, the weather turned vicious. Snow fell in torrents, blinding their path. The car's tires spun helplessly in the growing drifts until, with a sickening lurch, the SUV became hopelessly stuck. Tom gunned the engine, but the wheels only howled against the ice. "Don't worry," Tom said, though his voice betrayed unease. "We'll dig out in the morning." They huddled together in the SUV, the heater running intermittently to conserve fuel. The radio crackled with static. Outside, the blizzard roared like a beast. Emily, clutching her stuffed rabbit, whispered, "Daddy, is someone out there?" Tom froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She pointed to the frost-covered window. "I saw someone walk by." Tom peered into the swirling white chaos, but saw nothing. "It's just your imagination," he assured her. But that night, as the family dozed off, a heavy thud jolted them awake. The sound came from the roof of the car. Tom grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the icy wind slashing at his face. He scanned the vehicle, but nothing was there. Just the empty, howling night. Back inside, Sarah whispered, "I think we should pray." Her voice trembled. The hours dragged on, and by morning, their situation was dire. Snow had piled up to the windows, trapping them. With fuel running low and their phones dead, Tom made the fateful decision to trek out and find help. "I'll be back before dark," he promised, kissing Emily on the forehead. As he trudged into the storm, the wind screamed louder than before, almost like voices calling his name. Hours passed. The shadows lengthened. Sarah kept staring out the window, her nerves fraying. Then came the knocks, soft, deliberate on the glass. She froze. "Tom," she whispered, her breath misting in the freezing air. But no one was there, only endless white. Emily began to cry. "Mommy, he's here again." "Who, baby?" "The man I saw last night." Sarah's heart sank. "There's no one there," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. The wind whipped harder, carrying faint whispers that seemed to snake through the cracks in the car doors. Sarah pressed her ear to the cold glass, and the whispers became words. "He's not coming back." When the first scream pierced the silence, it was Sarah's. Tom didn't return that night or the next. By the third day, their food was gone, their fire reduced to embers. The storm had swallowed the world. In desperation, Sarah ventured out, carrying Emily on her back. They stumbled through the snow for hours until a dark shape loomed ahead. A small ranger station. Relief flooded Sarah as she banged on the door. A ranger opened it, his face solemn. "Ma'am, are you lost?" "My husband. He went to find help," Sarah sobbed. "He left 2 days ago." The ranger's brow furrowed. "No one's been through here for weeks. The storms blocked all the roads." "No, he came this way," she insisted, clutching Emily tighter. The ranger's face paled. "Wait here," he muttered, retreating to his radio. As Sarah stood there trembling, Emily tugged on her coat. "Mommy," she said softly. "Daddy's right behind you." Sarah whipped around, her blood running cold. There was no one there. The ranger returned moments later, his face ashen. "Ma'am," he stammered. I think we found your husband." "Where?" He swallowed hard. "About a mile from here, frozen in the snow." "But," his voice cracked, "it looks like he's been dead for 3 days." Sarah's knees buckled. "That's impossible," she whispered. "We heard him. He knocked on the car." The ranger stared at her, his voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, it couldn't have been him." From behind Sarah, Emily spoke again. "It wasn't Daddy," she said, her voice hollow. The room plunged into silence as the wind outside howled once more, and faintly, just faintly, Sarah heard the knock at the door.